Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this mini-series about the exchange sacrifice in the middle game. In this video, I'm actually starting out with a tactical position, but I'll take a look at that and use that as a lead-in to a discussion of the positional exchange sacrifice. So follow along, you'll see how we get there. This game I'm showing first is another one of the games in the series of games played between John Cochrane and Mahesh Chandra Banerjee in the 19th century in India. This game was played in Kolkata in 1854. Cochrane has the white pieces, and the material is completely even at this point. Both sides have all their pieces on, so it's a crowded board. Just a couple of pawns have been traded, so both sides have 6 pawns. So even the material, but white's in a good position. He's set up for the attack, so looks like a good game for white at this point. Cochrane continues with bishop g5, preparing to exchange off some of the defenders around black's king, a classical strategy. h6 was played, forcing the exchange. Well, the bishop could retreat, but that's not what white wants to do. And then white steps aside with the queen, so that the rook is looking at the knight and the queen is looking at the h-pawn. So we can see that there's an exchange sacrifice being set up here. In fact, maybe even the plan starting with bishop to g5 was setting up this exchange sacrifice. Anyway, Banerjee did not worry too much about it and played rook to d8, brings the other rook to the center. Well, this rook will be able to come up and defend if it's given another move. So the time to strike is now. Rook takes knight, bishop takes rook, and queen takes pawn with check. And the king steps over to g8. And now a very clever follow-up is knight to h5. So he's not actually sacrificing the knight at this point, because if the pawn takes knight, the queen will take the bishop. But Banerjee wants to chase the knight away, so he drops the bishop back. And maybe he thought the knight would have to move, but Cochrane is not moving that knight. He brings another knight into the game instead. So this is the kind of play that Morphy would be very happy to see. Giving up the knight, but in exchange the king position has been pretty much destroyed. There's this open file, and this rook can get over there in 2 moves. Especially, it helped by this knight. The knight was on c3, but when it moved to e4, it also allowed the rook to get into the game within 2 moves. So things are coming together for white here, yeah, it's white's turn to move. He plays rook c3, continuing with the attack immediately. Banerjee comes up with a clever defense here. Plays rook to e6. He is a whole rook up at this point, because Cochrane first sacrificed the exchange and then sacrificed a piece, so he's a rook down. So he can afford to give some material back. And this is not actually giving back the whole rook. The idea is that after pawn takes rook, bishop takes knight. So he's given back a little bit of material and managed to bring another piece over for the defense. But things are still in a bad way for black. Cochrane continues with e takes f7. Banerjee replies with king to f7. Now c5, bringing the last piece into the game. So all of white's pieces are active at this point. The king goes to e7. Actually, maybe it's really just the bishop and the queen. The rook is a latent force here, defending the bishop and ready to hop in on an open file. This bishop is actually controlling some squares that prevent the rook from just attacking on any file. But it's all over for the king, because his pieces are on the wrong side here. These pieces are, and the queen can come in on the light squares, avoiding this dark squared bishop and coming in on the light squares. So the king has to go back to f8, and now the queen can't come here. That would just be a trade, but the queen can go all the way to g8. King goes back, and now queen f7 is mate. So a nice little king hut there at the end. But I wanted to back up to a certain point in that exchange. Well, let's go forward. Let's go forward again. Guess it's easier to get there from this point of view. King, bishop g5, h6, takes. Took with the knight. And then queen e3, rook d8, exchange sack, bishop takes, queen takes, check, king over, and knight up. This is the point I wanted to look at and use as a jumping off point for discussion of the positional sacrifice, because there's another line here. Besides retreating the bishop and trying to win more material or chase the knight away, black could have just taken the knight and given up the bishop. And black is still material up here, because is the exchange up, and white has only gotten a pawn, and he plays the move rook to d6 here. I worked this line out using a chess engine, so this represents best play for both sides. Or I mean, there's more than one line, but this is one of the good lines for both sides. So the queen is chased back, and now you have to look at this exchange sacrifice a little bit differently. You have to say, I've given up something. What do I have in compensation? So you have, in this position, you have two things in compensation that you can see right off. Well, first is you have a pawn, which is important. That could be useful in the endgame. And then the second thing is you've got a weakened king side. So there are these weak pawns over here and open lines. In this kind of position, you should be able to look at it and say, yeah, that's good enough compensation. But well, let's take a minute and ask exactly how much is the exchange worth? Now, Rod McNevin commented on my previous video that the value of the pieces will actually change during a game. But we're talking about on average and in general in the middle game. So towards the end game, to discuss how the pieces change in value, the rooks become stronger in the end game because as the pawns get traded off, there's more open files, so they can become more active. And correspondingly, the bishops also become stronger in the end game. And a lot of times the knights become weaker because it takes them a long time to move from one side of the board to the other. So if there's action on both sides of the board, then they tend to lose some of their value, whereas the other pieces can hop around from one side to the other more easily. But in the middle game, when things are more crowded, the knight can hop around and find squares to go to, where sometimes the bishop is blocked in by pawns as well as the rooks, and they always have to worry about getting trapped. So in the middle game, it's generally thought that the bishop and the knight are worth a little more than 3 points. Or, well, another way to look at it is, what is the difference in value when you give up the exchange? And if you take 5 minus 3 and get 2, that's the usual answer. But in practice, an answer of around 1.5 is closer to the truth in a typical middle game position. So if you can think of, if you can give up the exchange for a pawn and then find what you think is half a pawn's worth of compensation in the form of weaknesses in your opponent's camp of some kind or another, then you should really consider that as an exchange sacrifice. Another example of a half point worth of compensation is the bishop pair. The bishop pair is generally considered to be worth half a point. So if you could, for example, sacrifice the rook for a bishop and a pawn, you could end up in a situation where you have the bishop pair and your opponent doesn't, and you have the pawn. And you could view that, even if you have no other compensation, you could view that as a materially even exchange and just try it out. So the reason I'm hammering on this point is I think you need to try out these exchange sacrifices to find out how they work for you. But you should feel pretty free to try it out. You don't need to get 2 pawns worth of compensation. And if you give up the exchange for 2 pawns, maybe the pawns don't turn out to be that valuable in the particular position. So, but giving it up for a pawn and some other kind of compensation is often a reasonable thing to do. So, well, let's follow this line. I worked it out, like I said, with the chess engine. So I'm not going to comment on every move, but just to kind of show how things might develop from here. Your job, if you're down the exchange, your job is to activate your pieces and try and prevent your opponent from activating his pieces. And also look for those advantages you have and try and see how to exploit them. If you're on the other side, if you're on the side that is down the exchange, then that means you have an extra rook. And so your job is to figure out how to activate those rooks and bring them into the game. And if you can go quickly into an endgame, sometimes his rooks will be very powerful and will change the tide. So your idea may be just to exchange, well, in particular, you want to exchange pawns to open up lines. But if you see an opportunity to drop into an endgame where you have a rook versus a minor piece, that's definitely something you can go for. Okay, but anyway, king h8, rook to f1, piling up on this pawn, rook to g8, giving up that pawn but activating the rook over here. Queen to h4. It's interesting, the chess engine is not interested in grabbing a pawn and losing some material, but is going after this pawn. The other rook comes over to defend, and now rook to f6. So the queen here was not only attacking the pawn, but helping to support this rook lift. Rook g to g6, doubling this way. So in exchange, I guess you also shouldn't be too afraid to exchange, especially if it helps your cause. Okay, and after rook g6, bishop to c2, hitting the rook again. So not grabbing that pawn, but making sure your pieces are active. And here's a clever move from black, e4. We'll see the point of this. After bishop takes, then the rook moves. So he gives up a pawn anyway, but the bishop has been put in this square so that the knight can't hop in. That was the point of that sacrifice. It's kind of an obstruction sacrifice to prevent the knight from easily getting over. A knight on this square, for example, would be really deadly. So anyway, it's white's turn. Queen to g5, hitting the rook. Queen to d6, defending. King to h1, stepping aside, getting away from maybe checks on that diagonal. Bishop to c8, c5. Here we see the other advantage coming into play. Well, black had to give up a pawn to defend on this side against the attacks on the king. So now white has two extra pawns and is starting to mobilize them. And then the pawns are coming through like this. Let's see. The queen goes to f6, and then after the queen trade, rook takes f6. This is actually a winning position. Even though white is still the exchange down, white now has two pawns for the exchange. And the rook, although it's better in the endgame in general, it has trouble stopping a protected pair of pawns like this. And in fact, this position is just winning for white. Let's see, I had a question here. Why not queen takes pawn? Oh, can't, yeah, sorry. Queen takes pawn is meant by queen takes rook. Okay, so anyway, that's it for this game and a little discussion about positional sacrifices. Let's look at the next example. The next game I wanted to look at was played in 1969 at the World Championship match between Tigran Petrossian and Boris Spassky. So Petrossian was world champion at the time, Spassky was challenger, and he had challenged previously. They'd fought a previous world championship match in 1966, and Spassky had lost. So now he's coming back for a second time, and he did manage to win this one, which set up the famous Fischer-Spassky match of 1972. But in this match, he's got to take down Petrossian, who's really at the top of his form at this point, and they played some really great games. This is one of them. Spassky has the white pieces and Petrossian has the black pieces. Tigran Petrossian was really a master of the exchange sacrifice. So if you want to learn more about exchange sacrifices, you could do well by studying his games. Anyway, in this game, Spassky starts off with d4, get knight f6, c4, typical opening e6, maybe going for a Nimzo Indian, but Spassky plays knight f3, so Petrossian goes for the Queen's Indian with b6. So a3, bishop b7, this is a very standard line, knight c3, d5, and the main line here is actually taking, and knight takes back, but Spassky played something simple, a little out of the ordinary, just played e3 here, and this is fine for white, probably leads to an even position, but it's getting out of the book, I suppose. It's not out of the book, but it's getting into a less commonly played line. Maybe there won't be as much preparation here. So the game continues, knight bd7, c takes d5, taking with the pawn this time instead of the knight, but it makes sense to have a strong pawn here, trying to keep control over squares in the center. Bishop e2, bishop d6, b4. This is Spassky's idea. He sets up a strong center with that e3 move, and then he wants to push on the queen side. We'll see how this works out. Castles, castles, a6, maybe slowing down the onrush of the pawns, or maybe just keeping the knight from hopping into this square and harassing the bishop. Queen to b3, just piling up on the queen side here. Queen e7, rook b1, continuing with this queen side play. Knight to e4. Yeah, it's interesting that Spassky didn't take, but kept the knight here and just pushed on with the pawn. Gave Petrossian time to bring another knight in. Now b5, so we have contact here. Petrossian takes this moment to get rid of one pair of minor pieces. Just trades off the knight, gets the other knight into e4, which is a good square now, and it can't be traded off immediately. The queen drops back to c2. The rook comes to the c file. The f rook comes over to the c file. I guess it makes sense to keep both rooks over on the queen side if this is where white is building up the pressure. Bishop to b2, getting the last piece off the back rank, and c6, opening up a file towards the queen here. B takes, bishop takes, and the queen goes back to the b file here. Now queen d7. So the queen here was threatening to take this pawn. Spassky countered with a threat to take this pawn. So the rook came over to defend, and then Petrossian pushes with b5. So a5 kind of locks things up and makes you wonder if this plan was so great at this point. Seems like Petrossian has done a good job of stifling the attack. He drops the bishop back to b7, opening up the c file for his rook. But Spassky is continuing with knight to e5. Queen doesn't he doesn't want to trade here, so he just drops the queen back to d8, keeping an eye on this pawn. Maybe it'll keep the rook tied up. Rook f to d1 brings the rook over to the center, and then the queen bounced out to h4. So this was the idea of queen d8, and now queen here is looking at the f2 square, but it gets kicked back and comes back to e7, and now f3, chasing the knight away, and the knight goes to g5. So the knight has squares it can go to from g5. It can come back to here, for example, or to here if it gets kicked again. So h4 was played to kick the knight. Kicking at the, yeah, if he had kicked with the f pawn, it would have gone here, I suppose. But he kicked with the h pawn, so the knight has to run to e6, and then f4. So Spassky has pushed back black's little sortie on the king side, but there's a cost here. This structure around the king is a little bit weak. This bishop is trying to cover all of the holes on the light squares along with this knight. So it's probably okay for now, but there is some danger there. f6, kicking this knight back, so the knight won't be able to defend there so well. The knight drops back to f3. It won't be able to defend the light squares as easily. And now this knight comes into d8. There's a little knight maneuver here from Petrossian. The king comes up to f2. The knight goes over to f7, and this knight to d2. I wasn't really sure what this was about, but one idea might be that g5 could be played under the right circumstances. You know, the queen and the knight are looking at that square, and maybe opening things up against the king at the right moment. Could be an idea there. But something else happens in the game. This knight goes to d2, and Petrossian plays the move rook to c4. So this is an exchange sacrifice. It's an offer of an exchange sacrifice. If Spassky takes, Petrossian will just take back with the pawn, and there's a couple things that he's got. This is a pure exchange sacrifice. He does not have a pawn for the knight, but he does have this open diagonal for his bishop at the moment, although this bishop could oppose it. But I think the main point is this pair of passed pawns on the queen side is just going to be really strong the rest of the game, and he's willing to bank on that. And in fact, Spassky was not willing to play this line. He didn't go that way. He tried to live with this rook here for a while. So it's move 30 now. He played queen d3. Rook to e8 was played. Pressure on this pawn. Maybe this knight can somehow get into a position where it will add to the pressure there. Bishop to f3, looking at this center pawn here. Bishop to b4, coming out on the queen side. Maybe ready to trade itself for the knight at the right time. Bishop to a3. So Spassky decides to trade off bishops, or offer the trade, and Tigran Petrossian takes him up on it. So knight to d6 was played here. So the knight journey has continued. The knight started here, went to here, went to here. Now it's come around to d6, and now it's starting to look like a good piece there. Oops, clicked the wrong button. Knight d6, starting to look like a good piece there, and it's looking at this square as well as looking at the rook. Although probably still the idea is going to be to take back with the pawn if white decides to grab the exchange. Anyway, rook to e1 was played. More defense on the e-file, and f5, clamping down. That's a very Petrossian-like move, just trying to clamp down on white's structure and eliminating the possibility of these pawns coming forward. The chess engine was actually suggesting g5 was an interesting idea at this point. The knight's not here anymore, but we also don't have white's knight there either. So just with the queen supporting that pawn push, black could open things up against the king. Might be an alternative way of playing this position. Anyway, f5 is what Petrossian played. And now this rook, the a rook, dropped back to a1. I'll be trying to maneuver. And this knight immediately hops into e4 with a check. The bishop takes. Could have taken with the knight, I suppose, but that bishop maybe was not so valuable. It was just facing that wall of pawns. So he decides to give up the bishop. Now the queen has to move. Queen goes to d7. Looking at the light squares again. Yeah, the downside of having given up that bishop is their weaknesses on the light squares are more pronounced. Anyway, rook to a2, preparing to defend along the second rank. And rook e to c8, doubling on the c-file. And I think at this point, Spassky decided it was just too dangerous to allow black to continue to build up the pressure, and he might as well grab the exchange. So here we are on move 40 when knight takes c4 is played. So as I said, we were on move 30 when that rook was put on the c4 square. So the exchange was on offer for 10 whole moves, and then Spassky finally decides to take it. And let's see how this works out. The chess engine here is recommending the move rook to c2. But after bishop to d5, black is just completely blocked up here. White is just blocked up here in the center. And these pawns are mobile, right? The queen can come here, and this pawn can come forward, and the rook can go behind it. A very dangerous situation for white. But, well, according to the chess engine, this is the best defense. Let's see. Actually, it was rook c2 rather than rook d2, trying to stop that pawn from coming forward. But same idea. So Spassky played something different. Spassky decided to give a little material back. Played d5 just to get this active position with his rook. So he brings the other rook over to d1. So he's got a pin. But now we can say, if we talk about our rules of compensation, that black has a pawn for the exchange, and he has these powerful protected passed pawns, probably worth more than half pawn, a lot more. So, so this is a good position for black. In fact, he pushes on with c3 right away, not immediately unpinning, but taking advantage of this discovered attack on the rook. This rook goes to c2 now, and now the queen hops into h3, leaving the bishop hanging. This is a very clever move, but shows Petrossian being tactically alert. So if the rook takes the bishop, there's a check here, and notice that the king can't come forward, right? The pawn is guarding that square, so it has to go to the back rank, and then the queen can check on the back rank, and white's queen is loose on b1, so that would win the queen, so you can't play that way. So this Petrossian gets away with this move, queen to h3, relying on that tactic. So rook to g1, this rook was brought over so that the rook can defend with a check like that. Of course, there's no more pressure on the bishop. The queen goes to g4. We get some maneuvering here. King goes to g2. Queen comes in, f3 check. King goes to h2. So now the king is on this side and the pieces are here. So it looks like a pretty reasonable defensive setup. Hard to see how white is going, or black is going to break through that. But it did lose another pawn. So now black has 2 pawns for the exchange. And I think even on a material basis, we could argue that black is winning. But of course, the positional advantage is really strong as well with these passed pawns here. And the lack of counterplay from white. White has very little he can do in this position. Anyway, f5 was played. Petrossian, he likes to play actively, so he's going to try and do something anyway. Queen goes to c5. And rook goes to f1, putting the rook behind the pawn. Now b4. These pawns are just going to creep forward step by step. f6, trying to open up a line against the king. Now b3, hitting the rook, defended by the bishop. So everything is defended and the pawns are just marching forward, and the threats against black's king are just being ignored. So, well, the rook is under fire. Rook c to f2, so doubling on the f-file. And now c2, just keep on charging straight ahead. The queen goes to the side, and now e3 was played. Pushing those rooks around, trying to force something to happen over here. Also opens up this diagonal for the bishop. Might be useful. So this pawn went to f7 with check. Spassky has some interesting ideas here. Still desperately struggling, although it seems like it's just a lost position. King steps in front of the pawn to blockade it. Now the rook goes to f5, pinning the bishop and getting out away from the attack of the pawn. b2 was played here, attacking the queen. Queen takes it. So now this pawn can push forward and queen. So if Spassky just simply trades here, then black is material up. Say rook takes, queen takes, rook takes. Does it go like that, actually? Rook takes, queen takes, rook takes bishop, king takes pawn. Yeah, I didn't look at this line. Seems like he's getting the bishop, but he has this passed pawn here and a rook here. I guess that's a winning end game. Anyway, let's continue with the game as it was played. Spassky came up with this other idea, which is kind of clever. He played queen takes g7 check, so that when the king goes out of the way, now this pawn is going to queen too. But first, rook to g5 check was played. And, maybe he was hoping to do a cheapo if black was short on time. If black plays here, this wasn't played. That's checkmate, because this rook is defended here. So, but black just has to go here. And in fact, after rook g5 in this position, white resigned. He realized it wasn't working. But just to show how it might have continued. So the king goes to f8, could go to h8 as well. This rook comes in with check. King has to step aside, but there's just no mate here. He can keep taking and get a queen. But at the end of all of this, well, of course, black could take that rook, but there's actually queen f1 mate, and that would finish the game too. So anyway, this is let's go back to this position. This is how the game ended. So let's check out the next game. The last game I wanted to show you in this video was played by Levon Aronian. Aronian's a very interesting player. He's one of the few grandmasters that likes to play actively with his rook in the middle game, which is the kind of thing that's very difficult to get away with. You sometimes see amateurs trying this, and they usually get into big trouble. And you have to be willing, if you're going to play like that, to give up the exchange now and then when your rook gets into trouble. So anyway, his games are another good source of exchange sacrifices if you want to check them out, and very interesting play overall. This game was from when he was a young man. He was 19 years old, although already a grandmaster. It was played in the German Bundesliga in October of 2001. His opponent, Igor Kenkin, was another grandmaster. Levon has the white pieces here and starts off with e4. His opponent goes c6, preparing to play the Caro-Kann. And Aronian goes with d3, a very quiet response rather than the usual d4, a more typical move. But a very solid way to play. d5 is a normal response. So we get pretty standard line here. I'm sorry, this knight comes out to defend this pawn. g6, both sides decide to fianchetto and castle kingside. And e5, black builds up a big center. It's pretty interesting that black can get away with this, but on the other hand, he's falling behind a bit in development. So bishop g2, knight e7, castles, and then b4. This is an interesting move. It sort of reminds me of the previous game when Spassky was playing this queenside advance. But in this case, the pawn actually never goes very far. But this seems to be a standard line in this variation. I'm not that familiar with it. But the main move here by black is a5, and then white would take, and the queen would come out, and white would develop the bishop. So white gets all his pieces out. Black still has a couple pieces to develop, but on the other hand, white has a weak, isolated queen's pawn there. So this is a position that's probably around equal, and both sides can play this. But that's not what black chose to play here. He chose to go for a different line here. Maybe it's testing to see what Aronian had prepared, or just to see if he was familiar with this position. He played knight a6. And so Aronian just defended the pawn with a3. And this knight routes around to c7. So maybe it can come here to the center, jump into some of these squares. Well, this is off limits because of g3, but maybe you can get a knight into one of these squares. Anyway, bishop b2 is played, so white has finished getting his pieces off the back rank, and also there's some immediate pressure on this central pawn, and it's a little bit awkward. These knights are not in a good position to defend that pawn. So the move that was played was f6. That might be forced. And now rook e1, more pressure on the center. And black plays the move b6. This move seems to be getting black into trouble. The chess engine would prefer to play rook to e8 in that circumstance. Maybe there's already weaknesses in the center there that the computer can sense. And does seem that black gets into trouble with this b6 move. Anyway, Aronian seems to think so too. He seems to think that black is in a bit of trouble because he pushes immediately with d4. And this, although it seems to have wasted the tempo, d3 to d4, this is a very effective undermining move to put pressure on the center while black has not yet completed his development. I mean, he's threatening to open things up while black has not yet completed his development, and perhaps his knights are not so well placed. They look like they're caught in the middle of a maneuver, haven't quite finished getting to where they want to go. But anyway, black plays d takes e4. He's not afraid. In fact, he has an idea here after rook takes e4. Well, notice that Aronian takes with the rook instead of the knight. Then f5 was played. And if, as many players would play, the rook just drops back, then this is fine. In fact, this pawn can push on to e4. There is, a weakness on this diagonal, but there's no immediate way for white to exploit that. His knight is under fire. This bishop is shut out. This is a fine position for black. Black has taken some chances and gotten away with it. So how do you punish this kind of play? Well, the answer is you take that pawn with the rook and give up the exchange. And, well, unlike the previous game, black grabs the exchange right away, and Aronian takes back with the knight. So he's not trying to build that kind of positional pawn sacrifice where he's got a, a passed pawn to or anything like that. He's just playing for the better pieces. So let's look at this position and think about the value of the exchange again. Already white has one pawn for the exchange. He got that by taking the pawn. And he also has the bishop pair because he took off, well, to win the exchange, black had to give up the bishop. So white has the bishop pair advantage, which is half a point, and he has an extra pawn, which is a point. So he's already got his point and a half as compensation for the exchange. So it's something you would play even without any extra compensation. But on top of that, he also has this excellent knight here and immediate pressure on the c6 pawn. So this is a position where white has more than enough compensation for the pawn. White is better in this position. So black defends the c6 pawn. That was ready to be taken. And then Aronian just pushes on with c4. And I think this is a good example that white is not in any hurry. He's not, proceeding with crazy sacrifices or anything like that. He's just playing the game, just playing a normal game, just putting his pieces on good squares, taking space with his pawns, doing all the things you're supposed to do in the middle game. You don't have to do anything particularly exciting here in order to take advantage of being down the exchange. You don't have to worry, I guess, about being down the exchange. You just keep playing. So rook to b8 defends the bishop so that if this diagonal ever opens up, the bishop won't be hanging. Queen to b3 was played, putting the queen on the diagonal facing the king, exploiting one of the weaknesses in black's position. Knight to e8. So the knight is going to route around to a different square, but first white gets in this check, pushes the pawn forward with check. The other knight comes to d5 to block, and then white pushes on to c5. Notice the knight here, it's supported by the bishop and the queen and the pawn, but the pawn is about to be knocked out with this b5 move. That's a very clever move there, and this knight also can threaten to take out that pawn. So there's a lot of pressure on the c6 pawn there, and there's the queen and the bishop directly attacking that knight. So the other knight comes to f6. So maybe that was the idea when it first routed to e8 to go to the f6 square. And it's defending this knight, so it seems like things are holding together, but that loses a pawn because this pawn can just be taken. B takes f6, the bishop has to drop back. And now this queen is in the line of fire. So once again, Aronian is not rushing things. He just calmly drops the queen back, stays on this diagonal, keeps that knight pinned, and keeps pressure on the knight. So the king goes to g7 to unpin that knight. Black would like to be able to move it out of the way if it gets into any more trouble. And now Aronian brings his other knight in, knight d to c4. And now the queen comes over to c7. So the queen on c7 is looking to recapture this c6 pawn. It wasn't like black had given up hope of getting that pawn back. He plans to get it back. But rook to c1, placing the rook opposite the queen. Now b takes c5. We get this exchange. And white takes back. So that exchange was undermining this knight a bit. And the queen was also looking at this knight as well as looking at this pawn. But it's adequately defended. It's got the knight and the bishop defending it and only the queen attacking it. So no problem for white so far. And now the king goes to h6. So this is a funny move, and I had to spend some time figuring out. But let's look at what would happen if black continued with the plan of just getting his pawn back. Seems like good timing for this. He's got the queen and the bishop at the right square. But after an exchange here, knight takes c6, queen takes c6, we can see the problem. There were a couple of latent pins in that position which that exchange has brought to the fore. The knight was blocking this diagonal, but now This diagonal is open and this knight is pinned. And then this bishop is also pinning the knight on this diagonal, and that exchange brought the queen into this pin. So this is a deadly situation for black. He can't avoid the loss of material here. And a good illustration of the power of the bishop pair when as the position opens up, when these lines open for the bishops, they can really make their presence felt across the board and covering squares of both color. So anyway, it's white's turn here, and white proceeds with knight d6 with an immediate threat of taking this knight, and there's no way to defend against this except by giving up the exchange. This deflects the queen, and so this knight is momentarily safe, but black has given back the exchange. White is still a pawn up, and white still has a great attacking position here. So, oops, that line misfired, this line and this line. So this is just clearly winning for white. Let's back up. If black doesn't want to give up the exchange, he's just going to lose material. Say he tries to unpin with king h6, then just bishop takes f6. Knight can't take it. This knight can't take it because it's still pinned. So rook takes, and then bishop takes. You just eliminated the defender, and that knight was hanging. So black loses a piece in that case. So he has a choice of giving back the exchange, or losing a piece and being in a bad position anyway. So that explains why in this position black played king h6 in advance. He's just getting away from all of those pins and freeing up his knights to move. Knight d6 was played anyway, but now this knight can move away. It goes to d7, and momentarily black is still holding on to his extra material, but now Aronian plays the move knight e to f7, and black resigns. So that was it for this game. Let's try and unpack it a little bit here, explain what happens in this final position. Say rook takes knight, giving the exchange back, but hoping to survive the attack. He doesn't, I'm sorry, the best move here is not to take back with the knight, but to take back with the queen. This knight is perfectly safe here, defended by the pawn, and it can jump in later. And this bishop is still striking down this diagonal, so queen takes f7 is much stronger. It's threatening to win another piece here. So this knight moves away, knight f to g8 is best. Then the queen can come into g7 with check, defended by the bishop. The king can run here, and then bishop to f3. And it's mate next move. There's nothing to prevent the mate with the pawn there. So anyway, that would be how the game might have finished if black had chosen to play it out. But after the move knight e to f7, black just resigned. Okay, that's it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to show a few more examples, some less common themes with the exchange sacrifice, and I will see you then. Bye now.